But if you do not have these three things in place, you do not have a legally binding contract. Contract law is the law of contract. It's the law of a written document. So in our world, contracts that we use regularly are tenancy agreements. They are terms of business between the letting agency and the landlord. They are terms of business with the contractors that you might use. This is what contract law is referring to. We're referring to the clauses within a contract. But we have to remember that in the UK, we have something called statute law, which basically is the law of the land, okay? So statute law is the law that we cannot change. We cannot change it through contract. We cannot change it through any means. So regardless of what you put into your contract, if it is in confliction with statute, that statute law always prevails. Statute law supersedes contract law in every single aspect. I've had a landlord come to me and ask me, can I put a clause in the contract whereby I only need to give them 30 days notice? Well, you can write that into your contract, but it is not legally enforceable because statute law clearly states that a landlord in England needs to give a minimum of 2 months' notice should he require the property back. So if he was to put that in the contract, the statute law would stamp on that and say, no, the landlord cannot do that. The statute law overrides that. And regardless of the fact it's in a contract that has been signed, it cannot be enforced. Another really common one that I have seen and is arguable is where landlords or letting agents put into the contract that the tenant has to give you 2 months' notice, or the tenant has to give you 1 month's notice. Now, statute law actually states that if a tenant is in a fixed term, they legally don't need to give you any notice to end the contract as long as they hand the keys in on the last day of the fixed term, because they have completed that contract through fulfillment. If a tenant moves into a property and it's a 6-month tenancy and they complete that 6-month tenancy and they give you the keys back on the last day of that tenancy, they have fulfilled their obligations under the contract. Now, if you do have in your contract that a tenant can give 1 month's notice, I don't want you to take that out. Please leave it in there, because most tenants will see that and they will give you the notice that the contract asks for. And of course, this is best for our landlords to be given a notice period. If you get a clever tenant that says, actually, legally, I don't need to give you any notice, I've fulfilled my contract and here is my keys, the only route you can take to try to pursue them for that notice period would be through a court of law. And you're most likely to lose because statute would override. These are some of the laws of the land. I hope that you all know that you must not kill people. That includes your landlords or your tenants, although on occasion, I'm sure you feel like you might want to. You also know, or you should know, that you must not steal. We cannot go out and take something from a shop and not pay for it. We must not steal. It's law of the land. In the UK, it is also law of the land that you drive on the left. If you were to drive on the right, not only would you be causing accidents, but you would also be breaking the law. And in the UK, we must also not sell alcohol unless licensed. These are just a few of the things that have law of the land. There are obviously many, many more. But what you will notice from the content of these laws of the land, they haven't been looked at for many, many, many years. And that's the same with a variety of laws that we still operate in. So there are 3 key things that need to exist in order for a legally binding contract to exist. So there needs to be an offer, there needs to be an acceptance, and there needs to be a consideration. So I'm going to talk about tenancy agreements. Let's put it into layman's terms for us. The offer is the property. The landlord is offering you a property to rent. The acceptance is a tenant saying, I would like to rent your property from you, and I am happy to sign an agreement to do so. And finally, the consideration. The consideration is, in our terms, it's the rent. Okay, so it's the rent the tenant is willing to pay to the landlord for his offer of the property. Now, I just want to be clear that consideration does not need to be monetary. It can be material things, but it doesn't have to be money. So it could be services, it could be employment, it could be something that is not necessarily money. But if you do not have these three things in place, you do not have a legally binding contract. So that's something that I want you to bear in mind, okay? It's not very often that you will come across contracts, there's no rent payable, for example. But I have come across a landlord that has come to me and said, Dawn, I would like to rent the property to my son and his two friends, and I would like to rent it to them for free. I'd like you to manage it because I don't want to be privy to that contract, but I don't want to charge them any rent. In this scenario, this is where I had to have a conversation with the landlord to say, understand why you don't want to charge your son rent, but in order for there to be a legally binding contract that we can enforce and act upon, there needs to be some form of consideration. And therefore, I recommended to the landlord, he did a rental amount of £1 per quarter, £1 per month. There was then a form of consideration. That small amount of rent then created a legally binding contract that we could then enforce. Because don't forget, when you have a tenancy agreement, there's areas that you may need to enforce. So you may need to evict the tenant, but if your contract is not legally binding, it could cause you problems thereafter. But contracts have to be clear. Okay, they can't be written in legal jargon. It's really difficult to read and understand because it's all in court speak. It's all in not in layman's terms, which is why our tenancy agreements and our terms of business are clear. The clauses are clear. They're easy to understand. Contracts also have to be fair. I had a landlord that said, I want the tenant to mow the lawn every single week. I want that put into the contract that they mow the lawn every single week. Now that would be an unfair clause. You cannot put upon the tenant to mow the lawn every single week. Now, a fair clause would be that the tenant, under the terms of the contract, has the obligation to maintain the gardens throughout the tenancy. So maintaining the gardens throughout the tenancy would be fair, but asking that they do that every single week would be unfair. And there's loads of other things that could be entered into a contract that would be deemed unfair. So you just need to be ensuring that any clauses that you're putting in the tenancy agreement are fair and not in breach of statute law.